She was 24 years old and quietly ruined, with no family left to speak for her, and no place in the world that had not already been closed against her. And all she carried out of London was a small traveling case, a mended grey cloak, and a bone-handled needle case that had belonged to a woman 50 years in her grave. And with that, and a folded deed pressed into her hand by a duke who wished never to see her face again, she came into possession of a crumbling manor on the edge of Briar Ridge, a house so far gone that the duke's own steward called it a kindness to burn. But what nobody knew, and what the duke's family had taken great pains for 100 years to ensure nobody would ever know, was that behind one of its walled-up doorways lay something that would undo them entirely. Settle in, pour yourself something warm, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because this is a long story, and it deserves an unhurried hour. If you like tales of quiet women and the houses that saved them, subscribe before we begin, so the next one finds you. Margaret Ward had been born in the last snow of 1841, in a narrow terraced house in the parish of St. Anne's, Soho, to a father who kept the books for a linen merchant, and a mother who took in fine mending to help the rent. Her father died of a lung fever when Margaret was 9, quietly, over a fortnight, and her mother followed him within the year, less from illness than from the exhaustion of surviving him. There were no aunts to claim the child, no uncles to write, only a distant cousin of her mother's, who had married into service at a great house in Kent, and who arranged, by a series of careful letters, for Margaret to be taken on as a still-room girl at the age of 10. It was there, in the cool tiled still-room of Wexford Park, that Margaret came under the eye of Mrs. Alice Pettigrew, the housekeeper, a widow of 62, with iron in her back and a wedding band worn thin as wire, who saw in the pale small child something that the other servants had missed. Mrs. Pettigrew taught her, over the next 12 years, everything a woman of no fortune might need to keep herself: how to render a beef bone into 3 days of stock, how to turn a collar so the wear did not show, how to keep an account book in double column, how to press linen with a flat iron heated on the range, how to distill rose water and lavender, how to poultice a burn, how to write a letter of business in a firm hand, and above all, how to look at a broken thing and see, before anything else, what part of it was still sound. She was a woman of few words and long silences, and she never once told Margaret she loved her. But she left her. When she died in the spring of 1863, the small, bone-handled needle case that had been in her family since her own mother's time, wrapped in a scrap of blue flannel, with a note that said only, "For Margaret, who will know what to do with it." Margaret was 21 when Mrs. Pettigrew was buried, and the needle case went into her pocket that day, and it had stayed there, or near to her, every day since. She had risen after that, by the quiet mechanism of usefulness, to the position of junior housekeeper at a house in Belgravia belonging to a widowed cousin of the Duke of Alderwick, and it was in this household that she first came to the Duke's attention, though only as a name upon a list of servants, and later, as a competent young woman who could be trusted to inventory a library or oversee a spring cleaning without supervision. She was neither pretty in the fashion of the season, nor plain enough to be dismissed, and she had a way of standing in a room as though she had measured it, which unsettled men accustomed to being the only ones taking measurements. The Duke's cousin died suddenly in the autumn of 1865, of an apoplexy at his desk, and his affairs, being tangled with the Duke's own, fell into the Duke's hands to settle. There were papers in the cousin's study that had no business being there. Letters, ledgers, a small locked dispatch box, and Margaret, who had been the one to lock the study on the night the cousin died, and who therefore held the key, was the one who saw them before anyone else. She did not read what was not hers to read, but she saw enough of the outsides of things to understand that the Duke would not want a housekeeper who had been alone with that room, and she went to bed that night knowing, with the calm clarity of a person who has already lost most of what she was going to lose, that she would not remain long in her post. The dismissal came a fortnight later, not by the Duke's own voice, but by a letter from his solicitor, offering her, in lieu of a character reference and any further wages, the deed to a property in Briar Ridge, in the county of Northumberland, described in the letter as a small manor house of some antiquity, currently untenanted, and requiring, the solicitor conceded, a degree of attention. She was to sign a paper releasing the Duke from all further obligation, and she was to be gone from the London house by the end of the week. She read the letter twice, folded it into thirds, and went upstairs to pack her trunk. And she took with her only what belonged to her: the needle case in her pocket, 3 dresses, a pair of stout boots, a copy of Mrs. Beeton that had been a gift from Mrs. Pettigrew, a small tin of savings amounting to £4.11, and the folded deed, which she placed at the bottom of the trunk beneath her mended grey cloak. She did not weep in her room that night, because she had learned by then that weeping did not warm a room or pay a coach fare, and she did not go to the Duke's house to protest the terms, because she had also learned that protest, from a woman in her position, was only another form of humiliation. She sat instead at the small desk by her window, and wrote, in her careful bookkeeper's hand, a list of everything she would need to reach Northumberland, and she costed it out to the last penny. And when she had done, she blew out the candle and lay down in her clothes, because the fire had gone out an hour before, and she had not been given more coal. In the morning she rose before the maids, washed in cold water from the ewer, dressed in her second-best dress, because the best was folded already at the bottom of the trunk, and went down to the servants' hall to take her breakfast at the end of the long table, as she had done every day for 2 years. The undercook set a bowl of porridge before her, without meeting her eye, and the 2 housemaids who had, only a week earlier, come to her for advice on the laundering of a lace collar, now spoke around her, as if she were a piece of furniture already carried out. Word traveled quickly in a house of that kind, and the shape of her leaving had been decided somewhere above the green baize door, and had filtered down through the pantry and the scullery by the time the kettles were boiled. Margaret ate her porridge slowly, and drank her tea, and did not attempt conversation, and when she had finished, she carried her own bowl to the scullery, and rinsed it herself, which was a thing a junior housekeeper was not required to do, and she set it on the rack with the others, and dried her hands on her apron, and untied the apron, and folded it, and left it on the shelf where the clean aprons lived. The solicitor came at 11, a small dry man in a black coat with a leather case under his arm, and he was shown into the morning room, and Margaret was sent for. He did not offer her a chair. He laid a single sheet of paper on the writing table, and turned it toward her, and set the inkstand beside it, and he told her, in the tone of a man reading a railway timetable, that the paper released His Grace from any and all further claim, financial or moral, arising from her period of employment in the household of his late cousin, and that upon her signature, the deed to the Briar Ridge property would be considered fully conveyed. Margaret read the paper through once, from the heading to the seal, and she noted the phrase in full and final satisfaction of all obligations whatsoever, and she noted that her name had been spelt correctly, which was more courtesy than she had expected. She dipped the pen and signed Margaret Ward in the careful hand Mrs. Pettigrew had once corrected her upon, when she had been 15 and inclined to loop her letters, and she blotted the ink and set the pen down and stepped back from the table. The solicitor gathered the paper into his case, gave her a small nod that acknowledged nothing beyond the transaction, and departed. Neither the Duke nor any member of his household came to see her out. A footman she did not know carried her trunk down the area steps at 12:30 and set it on the pavement, and touched his hat and went back inside, and the door closed behind him, and Margaret stood on the pavement of a square she had swept the front steps of 6 mornings a week for 2 years, with her trunk at her feet, and the folded deed inside it, and the needle case in her pocket. And after a moment, she picked up the trunk by its worn leather handle and began to walk toward the cab stand at the corner, because standing still on a London pavement in November was not a thing that improved a woman's circumstances. She took a hansom to King's Cross for 1 shilling and 3pence, which was more than she had allowed for in her list, and she paid it without argument, because the trunk was heavy and the wind had risen. At the station, she bought a 3rd-class ticket to Newcastle for £1 and 6 shillings, and a further ticket by branch line and carrier's cart for the last 20 miles to Briar Ridge. And when she had paid for these, and for a mutton pie and a paper twist of tea, she had £3 and 1 shilling and 4pence left in the tin, and she noted the sum in the small book she kept for the purpose, and put the book back into the trunk. The train left at 2 in the afternoon, under a low grey sky that promised sleet before evening, and she sat by the window with the mended grey cloak drawn about her shoulders, and watched London slide away in a long procession of soot-darkened brick, of chimneys and washing lines, and the backs of terraces, of gasworks and canal bridges, and market gardens turning to open fields, and then at last of hedgerows and ploughland, and the flat grey of the North Road, running alongside for a while. She travelled through the short afternoon and into the long dusk, and the sleet came as promised, somewhere north of Peterborough, and rattled against the carriage glass, and the lamps were lit in the compartment by a guard who did not speak, and she ate half the mutton pie, and saved the other half wrapped in its paper for the morning. The country grew steeper and darker as they went north, and the stone in the field walls changed from the pale limestone of the Midlands to a harder, darker stone she did not know the name of, and the sheep in the fields were smaller and more thickly fleeced, and the villages the train slid past were built low against the wind, with their chimneys smoking horizontally. At York she changed trains, and waited an hour on a cold platform with her trunk between her feet, and she drank the tea from the paper twist, made hot again by a kindly woman at the refreshment counter, who charged her only a penny for the water, and she reached Newcastle after 10 at night, and slept sitting up on a bench in the station waiting room, with the trunk pressed against her knees, and the needle case held in her closed hand inside her pocket. In the morning she took the branch line west to a village whose name she practiced aloud so that she should not mispronounce it when she asked for the carrier, and at that village she found a man with a cart who was going out toward Briar Ridge with a load of feed, and would take her the last 12 miles for 2 shillings, and she climbed up beside him and drew the grey cloak tight, and watched the country open around her as they left the village behind. The road climbed, the hedges gave way to dry stone walls the color of wet iron, and the fields to rougher pasture, and the pasture to moor, and above the moor the sky was a great pale washed thing that seemed to go on without any interruption to the edge of the world, and somewhere on that high ground, the carrier told her when she asked, was the house she had come to see, and he said the name of it, and shook his head once, slowly, in the way of a man who has known a place for longer than he wishes to. They came upon the house at just past noon, and Margaret saw it first from a quarter-mile off, standing alone on a low rise above a fold in the moor, and even at that distance she could see that the roof line was broken, and that one chimney had begun to lean. The carrier drew the cart up at the gate, which was of iron and rust, and stood open on hinges eaten to lace, and he set her trunk down inside the gate, and touched his hat, and asked whether she wished him to come back that way in the evening, and Margaret thanked him, and said she did not, and he clicked to the horse and went on, and she stood alone on the weed-cracked drive, and looked at what the Duke had given her to be rid of. The house was of local stone, grey with a dark grain, laid in courses that had settled unevenly, at the west end, so that the whole west gable leaned perhaps 3 inches out of true. It stood 2 stories high, with attics above, 7 bays across the front, and a small square porch of the same stone, with a broken lantern hanging inside it. The roof was slate, and Margaret counted, standing there, 14 slates missing from the front slope alone, and the lead of the valleys was split in 3 places she could see. The windows were leaded in small diamond panes, some intact, some starred, 4 boarded with gray planks nailed rough across the mullions. Ivy had grown up the east wall to the eaves and into the guttering. A rowan tree had taken root in the parapet above the porch and stood 18 inches high, with its roots going down into the mortar. She lifted her trunk and carried it up the drive and set it on the porch flags, and she took from her pocket the great iron key the Duke's steward had sent north by post the week before, and she fitted it into the lock and turned it, and the door opened inward on hinges that groaned but held. The hall inside was long and stone-flagged, 24 feet by 12 at her pacing later, with a staircase of oak going up at the far end and a plaster ceiling above blackened at one corner, where water had come in. The smell was of damp lime and cold soot and mice. To the right lay a dining room with the shutters closed and a long table dusted gray. To the left, a parlor with a fireplace of veined marble, and a mantel from which one carved leaf had broken away and lay upon the hearth. Behind the stair was a passage to the kitchen, and the kitchen had a great range crusted with rust, and a scullery with a stone sink and a copper still fixed to the wall, and beyond the scullery, a dairy floored with slate, cold as a well. She went through the house room by room that first afternoon in her cloak, because it was colder inside than out, and she wrote in her small book what she found. 11 rooms usable with work, 4 with fallen ceilings, 1 wing at the north end shut off behind a heavy paneled door that would not open to her key. The steward had mentioned that wing in a single line of his letter, closed these many years, not fit, and she stood before that door in the failing light, and laid her hand flat upon it, and felt the paneling sound and dry beneath her palm, and she thought, not tonight, and turned back to the kitchen to lay a fire. She lived in the kitchen the first 3 weeks, sleeping on a straw pallet by the range, which she coaxed by degrees back into service, cleaning outward from that one warm room into the scullery, the dairy, the parlor, the hall. She swept, she scrubbed, she scoured the copper with sand and vinegar. She pulled ivy from the east window and glazed 2 panes with pieces of glass, bought for a shilling from a builder in the village 3 miles off. She kept her accounts in the small book each night by candlelight, and every night before she slept, she took the bone-handled needle case from her pocket and set it upon the shelf above the range, and looked at it a moment, and then blew out the light. And on the 22nd morning, having no more excuse, and having warmed the house as far as she could without opening it, she took the crowbar the builder had lent her, and went to the paneled door of the north wing. The door was locked, and the key long lost, and Margaret worked the flat of the crowbar into the jamb, where the wood had shrunk, and levered gently, patiently, the way Mrs. Pettigrew had taught her to lift the lid of a warped chest without splitting it, and after some minutes, the lock plate gave, and the door swung inward into a corridor, smelling of dust so old it had lost its damp. The corridor ran 20 feet to a single room at the end, and in that room, when she pushed the second door, she found a small chamber, paneled in oak from floor to ceiling, a narrow bed frame without its mattress, a writing desk under a shrouded window, and a fireplace bricked up flush to the chimney breast, with new brick that was not new, red brick faded pink, its mortar dry as chalk. She stood in the doorway with the candle in her hand, and understood that this was the thing. She fetched the crowbar and a bucket, and knelt at the hearth. The bricks had been laid, she saw, by a careful hand, but the mortar was old, and the courses came away one by one, under steady pressure, and she worked without haste, setting each brick in the bucket so as not to break the hearthstone. Behind the 5th course, the crowbar met air. Behind the 7th she could see, by candlelight, into the recess of an old fire opening perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, and set upon a slate slab within it were 3 things: a small oak box banded with iron, a leather wallet tied with tape, and, wrapped in a scrap of blue silk gone almost gray with age, something small and hard. Margaret sat back on her heels in the dust of 100 years, and did not reach in at once. She wiped her hands on her apron. She fetched a clean cloth from the kitchen, and spread it on the boards. Then, one at a time, she lifted the 3 things out, and laid them on the cloth. The oak box was heavy for its size, and when she raised its lid, the candle showed her rows of gold sovereigns laid in tissue, and beneath the tissue more coins, and beneath those a small chamois bag, which, when she loosened its string, gave into her palm 4 rings and a pair of eardrops set with garnets, and a plain gold locket with no picture inside it. She counted the sovereigns twice, sitting on the floor, and made it 162, which was more money than she had held in her life. The leather wallet held 2 folded papers and a letter. The papers were a deed and a codicil, both under seal, and Margaret set those aside to read by daylight. But the letter was written on good rag paper, folded in 3, and she turned it to the candle and read, "To whoever finds this, and I hope with all my heart, it will be a woman, and a young one. My name is Isabel Hartwell, and I was born in the year 1743, and I have lived in this house since I was 17, and I am now 60, and past mending. I was brought here as ward to the family whose name is on the front of the deed enclosed, and I was kept here quietly, because the marriage that made me their kin was not one they wished the world to know of, and I have understood this a long time, and made my peace with it. I have not been unkind to. I have been forgotten, which is a slower thing. In the 53 years I have been in this house, I have taught myself to keep bees, and to keep books, and I have saved from my small allowance every quarter what I could, and what I could not save, I earned by fine needlework, sent under another name to a warehouse in Durham. The sovereigns in the box are mine, honestly come by, and the rings were my mother's. The papers with them will be of use to the person who reads this, for they show what was done, and by whom, and they may be shown or they may be burnt as you see fit. Only do not lose them, for they are the only proof there is. I leave all of this to you, whoever you are, and I ask only that you use the house well, and be warm in it, and think of me sometimes, when the wind is in the north. I hoped for a daughter, and never had one. I hope you will do." The letter was signed Isabel Hartwell, in a hand very like Margaret's own careful copying hand, and dated the 12th of March, 1803. Margaret read it through twice, and then set it down upon the cloth, and unwrapped the scrap of blue silk in her lap. Inside was a silver thimble, worn smooth at its crown by long use, and marked inside the rim with the initials I.H. Margaret held it in the palm of one hand, and with the other took the bone-handled needle case from her pocket, and set them side by side upon the cloth on the dusty floor of the north wing, and sat there a long time without moving, while the candle guttered, and the wind went over the roof above her head. In the morning she wrapped the sovereigns in a linen square, put them into the oak box, put the box beneath the loose flag in the scullery she had already marked in her mind for such a purpose, and set the flag down again and swept ash across it. The papers she folded into oilcloth and laid at the bottom of her trunk, under the mended gray cloak, and the letter she folded smaller and kept in the pocket with the needle case. Then she walked the 3 miles into the village with 2 sovereigns changed into shillings, and began to spend, carefully and in the right order. She went first to the builder, who had lent her the crowbar, a man named John Redmayne, aged 51, a slater by trade, who kept his yard behind the smithy. She asked him what it would cost to make the front slope of the roof watertight before winter, and he came out the following morning in his cart, with his boy and a load of good Westmoreland slate, and spent 4 days on the roof, cutting fresh slates to size with a slater's stake and hammer, hooking them into the battens with copper nails, and dressing the split lead of the valleys with a bossing mallet until the whole front slope shed water again as it had been meant to do. She paid him £7 and 4 shillings, and he shook her hand at the gate and told her the west gable would need underpinning before another winter, but would stand this one. Then came Annie Bewick, aged 38, a widow who kept 3 cows on the common, and walked up from the village on a Tuesday with a stone jar of milk and a loaf of oat bread, and would not take payment. She said it was neighborly, and left it at that, and came again the next Tuesday, and the one after, and by the 4th Tuesday she was staying an hour to help Margaret scald the dairy and set the copper to rights. Then came old Thomas Iredale, aged 74, a retired estate carpenter who had worked at 3 great houses along the border, and had heard from Redmayne that the Briar Ridge house had a young woman in it, repairing sash by sash. He arrived one grey morning with a bag of chisels and a plane wrapped in sacking, and mended the staircase treads, the parlour shutters, and the mantel in the parlour, carving a new leaf for the missing one from a scrap of walnut so cleanly that in 6 months no one could tell which leaf was his and which was old. Margaret filed the deed and the codicil with a solicitor in Hexham, a Mr. Nicholson, aged 60, who read the papers through twice without speaking, and then told her, in a low, careful voice, that these were documents of considerable interest, and that she should on no account allow them out of a strong-box again, and he drew up on her behalf a plain letter, setting out that she was in possession of the house by conveyance from his grace, and in possession of certain further papers relating to the earlier history of the property, and he lodged copies with a firm in Newcastle and with a firm in York, so that no fire and no visitor could unmake them. Through October and November, Margaret worked from before light until after it. She plastered the blackened corner of the hall ceiling with lime and hair from Redmayne's yard, whitewashed the kitchen and scullery, cleaned every flue with a bundle of holly on a long pole, glazed the 4 boarded windows with new leaded panes ordered from Newcastle at £1 a pane, cleared the ivy from the guttering, cut down the rowan from the parapet, and mortared the loosened stones back into place. She turned the small chamber at the end of the north wing into a bedroom for herself, and slept there from the first frost onward, under 3 blankets and the mended grey cloak, with the silver thimble and the bone-handled needle case set together on the writing desk beside the bed. By December the house was known in the village as Miss Ward's, and the road up to it had been walked often enough that the weeds no longer closed over the ruts. Margaret went down on a Saturday to the market with a basket of mended linen she had bought cheap at a sale, and made saleable again with an evening's work, and sold every piece before noon, and came home with butter, salt, candles, and a length of blue stuff for a new apron. The following week she took an order for the altar linen of the parish church from the vicar's wife, a Mrs. Halstead, aged 45, who paid her promptly, and told 2 other households, and by the end of January, Margaret had steady needlework at fair prices from 4 houses along the valley. She kept bees in the spring, as Isabel Hartwell had done. Annie Bewick brought her a swarm in a straw skep on a warm April morning, and Margaret set them in the south corner of the walled garden she had spent March clearing, of nettle and bramble, and by June there were 4 hives, and by August honey enough to sell in the village at 8 the jar. Thomas Iredale mended the garden gate and would not be paid, and took instead a jar of honey and a slice of seed cake, and sat an hour on the porch bench he had also mended, telling Margaret the names of the fields visible from the rise, and who had farmed each one within his memory. People began to know her name without her giving it. The carrier who had brought her up from the village that first day, a man called Robert Peart, aged 46, took to stopping at the gate on his run to leave a parcel or a letter, and would drink a cup of tea in the kitchen if she offered, and would carry down her finished work to the coach for Newcastle, without charging her more than the fair rate. On Sundays, she walked to the parish church, and sat in a pew halfway down the north aisle, and Mrs. Halstead nodded to her at the door, and the vicar spoke her name in the greeting after service, as though it had always been spoken there. Small rituals formed. On the first Tuesday of each month, Annie came up with milk and stayed for dinner. On the last Saturday, Margaret took her needlework to the market. Every evening she wrote in her small book the day's takings and outgoings in the bookkeeper's hand her father had first shown her when she was 7. And every evening before she blew out the candle, she set the thimble and the needle case side by side on the desk, and every morning she moved them into her pocket together, and the pocket of her apron grew a small worn shape from the two of them lying against her hip through the working day. On a still evening in the second autumn, Margaret sat on the porch bench Thomas Iredale had mended, and looked down the drive toward the gate. The gate had been rehung on new hinges and painted black. The drive was clear of weed, and edged with stones she had set herself over 3 Sunday afternoons. The rowan was gone from the parapet, and the west gable was underpinned with fresh stone that Redmayne and his boy had laid in August. The house behind her was warm. The range in the kitchen was banked. A lamp burned in the parlor, where a length of altar linen lay half-finished on the frame. Above the porch, the slates were sound. There was no water coming in, anywhere. She thought, as she often did at that hour, about the people who had put her where she was. She thought of her father, who had shown her how to rule a column and set a figure square inside it, and of her mother, who had taught her to set a fine stitch by lamplight. She thought of Mrs. Alice Pettigrew, who had never once said she loved her, and had left her a bone-handled needle case in a scrap of blue flannel, with a note about knowing what to do with it. And Margaret, sitting on the porch 2 counties and 3 years away from that grave, thought that she believed she had, at last, known what to do with it. She thought of Isabel Hartwell, born in 1743, kept quietly in the north wing for 53 years, because a marriage had been inconvenient to a family whose crest was still cut into the stone above the porch, and who had put by her sovereigns, quarter by quarter, and hidden them behind 7 courses of pink brick, and had hoped for a daughter, and never had one. Margaret took the silver thimble from her pocket, and the bone-handled needle case with it, and set them on the arm of the bench, side by side, as she set them each night on the writing desk, and thought that 2 women who had never met her had between them furnished her with everything she needed to begin. She thought of the Duke, who had signed the deed to be rid of her, and of the solicitor, who had spelled her name correctly, and turned the paper toward her, without offering her a chair. Mr. Nicholson in Hexham had written her twice in the past year to say that certain inquiries had been made after the papers lodged in Newcastle and York, and that no further action had followed, and that in his professional view no further action would. The Duke, it seemed, understood that what had been buried for 100 years was better left in Margaret's keeping than pulled into daylight now. Margaret understood the same. She did not need to use the papers. Having them was enough. It was a quiet kind of authority, and it suited her. Annie Bewick came up the drive with a covered basin under a cloth, called out from the gate, and Margaret raised her hand. The moor beyond was going blue with the last of the light, and a thin coal smoke rose straight from the kitchen chimney into a still sky, and somewhere down in the fold of the ground, a curlew called once, and did not call again. Margaret Ward was 24 and cast out. She had no family, no place, and no character to her name. Only a bone-handled needle case in her pocket, a mended grey cloak, and £4 and 11 shillings in a tin. She had signed a paper in a London morning room, releasing a duke from all further obligation, and in return, she had been given the deed to a crumbling manor on the edge of Briar Ridge that his steward had called fit to burn. It was the best paper she ever signed. If this story kept you company tonight, settle in and stay a while with the channel. Subscribe, share it with someone who is quietly starting again, and tell us in the comments where you were watching from, and what small worn thing you carry in your own pocket that a person who loved you once put there. And when you think of Margaret sitting on her porch bench with a silver thimble and a bone-handled needle case laid side by side on the arm of it, ask yourself this: what has come into your life looking like a burden? That time and patient work might yet turn into a home.